We are going to get started. A couple people winding their way in. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to help us celebrate BSR's 30th anniversary. This is the first in a series of events similar to this that we will be doing not only here but also in Paris in 2 weeks, in Tokyo and Singapore in late November, and in Washington and London in Q1 of next year. I should have introduced myself. I'm Aron Cramer. I'm President and CEO of BSR. I'm delighted you're here. So again, thank you very much for joining us. I've had a couple of people mention the BSR conference, and I'm going to take a moment to say that we've essentially retired the old BSR conference in favor of smaller gatherings that we will be doing as we continue to adapt and are thinking about what that will look like for 2023. So I thought it was important to say that. We are so grateful on our anniversary for the community that you are all an important part of and that allow us to do what it is that we do. Our amazing team, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, and feel like our mission is working with business to build a just and sustainable world could not be more important at this particularly unique and extraordinary point in time. I will say that the impetus for BSR came from a very simple but ultimately very powerful idea, which is just that business has both the opportunity and the obligation to deliver benefits for society. And now that might seem like the most obvious thing you've ever heard sitting here in 2022, but at the time when BSR got started, it was a simple, powerful idea that did not reflect the reality of how people saw the world. And so as we are enmeshed in debates over how to make net zero a reality, human rights due diligence, the ins and outs of reporting and disclosure rules, that's all crucially important, but let's remember also that sometimes a simple and clear vision is really what we need to achieve human progress. I want to thank by name two people who were so central to BSR's founding: our founding chair, Arnold Hyatt, and our founding CEO, Bob Dunn. Both of them had a strong vision and had to sort of do this up from the bootstraps when it was a very different world and BSR was a very different organization. So in addition to the dozens and dozens and dozens of colleagues who have worked at BSR and made us what we are, I want to offer thanks to them today. As you can see from this lovely banner behind me, we are going to talk about the future of sustainable business. And even though this is tied to our 30th anniversary, we're not really going to look backwards. We want to look forwards. That's so crucial. And I'll start with just a very brief overview of the strategy that BSR has adopted looking out to 2025. It builds on our core model where we work with our member companies and other partners from civil society and philanthropy, government, and other areas, doing really three things: providing insight, looking at the world as it is changing, providing advice to help companies implement sustainability and do it effectively. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And also building collaborations to achieve the kind of systemic progress that we all want. So that is somewhat familiar. We have, though, added and changed some things as well. One is we've established three core principles that we want to use as a North Star or a Northern Galaxy, three, not one, but as really signposts for all that we do. The first is we focus on impact in everything that we do. The second is that we see connections between issues and also advance the connections between business and the entirety of society. And then third, we are here to deliver honest advice, ambitious advice to help see credible action. I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of action in the world right now, and not all of it is credible. So we're here for credible action that achieves impact. So the core model and these core principles, they shape our approach. Now, we've also taken a look at the objectives that we have as an organization. Where do we want to have impact? On what issues? So there's 6 or 7 things I will point to. And we're about to relaunch our website, and so have a look at our website coming soon, because there will be lots more detail than I'm going to get into today. But climate, of course, is a crucial area for us. We now see what a 1.2 degree world is like. We are on a path to exceed 1.5. And so the urgency is, I think, obvious to everyone in this room. We are focusing on delivering climate scenarios, new climate scenarios that came out just last week to paint a picture of the possible futures we're facing on climate. Working with some partners through one collaboration, the Transformed to Net Zero group, to outline what effective, credible, valuable climate transition action plans look like, and a lot of work on just transition or climate justice, which of course, and I see Sonda here, will be so important at COP27 in just a few weeks. Nature. So 2023 is a year when nature is really going to become even more important on the global agenda and the business agenda. We will have a global framework and goals coming later this year at COP15 for nature and biodiversity. Methodologies will be coming for the science-based targets on oceans and water and land as part of the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, which is coming soon. We are helping companies prepare for all of this by understanding the dependencies they face and their impacts, and to prepare them for setting strategies and facing up to the need to be more transparent and disclose progress. And so we've created a new standalone team that is working with many of our members and many other partners on nature. So that's very exciting. Equity and social justice. Actually, if you follow, this is actually following E, S, and G. Equity and social justice. And we launched this year a Center for Business and Social Justice, where we're building a collaborative platform, shared governance for companies, funders, other partners to look at ways that they can collaborate to advance racial equity, gender equity, economic equity, et cetera. And we hope that this will also be the basis for businesses to use their voice and extend their actions to protect democratic processes and institutions. When I arrived at BSR to start a human rights program long ago, I never thought that we would be talking about protecting democracy in the United States, but here we are, and it's crucial that we act. We're also working on other issues related to equity, inclusion, and justice. I mentioned just transition, and I think the world is waking up to the fact that climate is not an environmental issue. In the end, it's ultimately about the lives we human beings all are able to live. And I'm delighted that after a lot of time, companies are now really looking to figure out what climate justice means to them, and this is something that we're working on both in collaborative and one-on-one environments. I'd also say stay tuned. We'll have some exciting news about the next phase of our HER project, which has benefited the lives of more than 2 million women working in global supply chains around the world, as we're looking to take that collaboration bigger and broader. So stay tuned for news on that in the year ahead. On human rights, a large focus on technology and human rights, and the plea I would make today is that this is not just something for Google and Meta and pure play tech companies. It really is true that every company is a tech company and is deploying facial recognition, artificial intelligence, frankly, employee monitoring of their own staff, and understanding the impacts and ensuring that human rights and privacy protections are present in both the design and the delivery of these technologies is crucial. We've got a long way to go on that. Last, on governance, it has been also very gratifying to see the degree to which boards of directors are taking sustainability more seriously. I had a discussion with a few people this morning, and the consensus was, yes, they're talking about it, but maybe not yet fully equipped to act on it and to provide the kind of breadth of vision that is needed to be a good steward of business. And so we have the great opportunity now to be working with more and more boards as they are trying to understand what to do, looking at board composition, which is crucially important, and at a time when, let's face it, bandwidth is a huge issue for business leaders. You may have noticed there's a lot going on out there. I think boards really need to play this role more strongly, and changing regulations will only reinforce that. The last thing I'll say, and something that again is new, is that we have taken a more systematic effort to express BSR's point of view on various processes to create new regulations, to launch new initiatives, and so you will see our voice on feeding into European dialogues on reporting and disclosure, also with the U.S. SEC, human rights due diligence, and a range of things. And again, on our website, you'll see this take a more prominent view. So really excited about what the path ahead looks like. And while we're mostly going to talk about the future, I actually want to take a couple of minutes to talk about where we are today. There's a lot going on, and it is absolutely the case that sustainable business has remarkable momentum that we've never seen before. There are also a lot of crosswinds. So certainly recession fears, inflation concerns, but I would say that sustainability is, of course, for the long run. I think we all know that. Economic cycles come and go, and it is absolutely crucial that businesses stay focused on what we are trying to build through action on climate and equity and human rights, and not be deterred or distracted by economic crosswinds, as significant as they are. Second, there are a lot of questions being raised about sustainable business that are not only legitimate, but are very important. We all need to do a much better job of closing the gap between ambition and action, between commitment and delivery. We need to use language that the world actually understands and not get caught in endless semantic debates about ESG, green, sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to try to ensure that ambition remains without veering into greenwashing. Not every gap between a big ambition and delivery today should be considered greenwashing. Too often that label is slapped on things. Nonetheless, there is some out there, and we need to stay focused on all of this. So these are fair and crucial questions and challenges. There's a third category of challenges that I don't think is quite so legitimate, and I do want to talk a little bit about that. So the backlash against ESG, it's a topic we've heard a lot about. Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson from the FT has done a great job of covering this from Moral Money. But let me take this head on, because I think we really need to. So part of the attack is based on outright falsehoods. Those who are claiming that ESG is inconsistent with fiduciary duty are selling a lie, as simple as that. ESG is used as a lens to understand how companies can not only manage risk, but also navigate the changes that are present in the world. And so if you have state treasurers suggesting that fiduciary duty is being violated, it's simply not the case. The second is sometimes the case is made that ESG represents an imposition of elitist values on a poor, unsuspecting public. Again, just not true. ESG is designed to help ensure that all people are treated, all people, with respect and dignity, that societies become more equitable, and that human rights and rule of law are respected. The third thing we hear and we sometimes see is debates that present, well, on the one side this, on the other side that. There are not two legitimate sides to every question. Climate and nature are declining. We know that from scientific analysis. Income inequality continues to be a significant problem. We know that from all of the economic data that we can see. So the game that's sometimes played, called both sidesism, it is a misdirection from what is really going on in the world. So I think you can tell I care about this particular topic. I think it's crucially important. So all of us need to address the legitimate critiques that are out there, and there are many, and it's up to us to do better on those things. It's also up to us to combat the misinformation and disinformation that is coming from well-orchestrated and well-funded people and institutions out there. The good news is we see no evidence that companies are making a U-turn, and we see no evidence that investors are slowing down in a meaningful way. Harvard Business Review did a survey this summer asking investors, is ESG investing here to stay? By a ratio of nearly 5-to-1, the answer was yes. And we still see capital flows moving, and yes, there's a lot of noise in the system, but I think overall progress is continuing. So about the future, I will not get into that. We're going to have a great debate in just a minute on exactly what that means. We talk a lot about business cases and all of this. But let me just say that while we can't predict what futures we actually see, there are values that should underpin the kind of future we want to build. So I think the people who work on just and sustainable business are focused on equity, on democracy, on cooperation, on social cohesion, on innovation, objective truth, respect for the natural world, and intergenerational fairness. These are things that we should stick to. The world is messy now. It will continue to be messy. But I think a values-based approach to shaping the futures that we're trying to build are just absolutely essential. A couple things before I introduce Andrew, who will take us to the next part of the day. First, I want to thank our sponsors who were up on the screen before and will be again. Spark member companies, Coca-Cola Company, Microsoft, and Google, and sponsors for today, Verizon, the Walt Disney Company, L'Oreal, and Qualcomm. Thank you to all of them. This is our 30th anniversary. We talk a lot about 2050 and net zero by that date or before. BSR, in its lifespan, is closer to 2050 than it is to its origins, and just clicked into me today. What does that mean? It means that 2050 will be here in a heartbeat. We're building it today, and we need to get after it. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to accomplish. There's a lot of benefit. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of reason to think we can build a future that, however we define it, is going to be much better. So thank you. Thank you for being here. I want to now bring up Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson. He is the U.S. business editor for the Financial Times. He co-launched the Moral Money vertical at the FT, which has become required reading, in my opinion, for anyone who cares about the things that you evidently care about, since you're here today. And I always enjoy my debates with Andrew. They typically go beyond the time we've set aside for it, which is a good thing and a good sign. So Andrew's going to chair the debate. Andrew, come on up.
Thank you, Aron. Panel, while I just say a few words, if I can pull everybody up. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. As Aron has been a fantastic interlocutor and a great contributor to my thinking about this subject, as have several of our panelists. I'm Andrew Edgecliffe-Johnson. I'm the US business editor of the Financial Times. And from where I sit, I have to say the future of sustainable business is in some question. That might surprise you to hear me say that. You know, I helped launch Moral Money with my colleague Gillian Tett. It has tracked over the 3-odd years since we launched it the amazing change in the corporate consensus around this subject. You know, I don't meet many CEOs now who don't claim to be thinking about the long term, thinking about equity, you know, ticking every box in every ESG survey that's just landed in their inbox. This is what's one of the reasons we set this up. Was this is the stuff that CEOs actually wanted to talk to us about, rather than the tricky stuff about, you know, their profit warnings and things like that, or, you know, where things were going wrong. And we wanted to bring the right kind of you know, skepticism, but also a constructive approach to, well, what's working and what's not. Look for the, you know, for the trend, but also the grit in the oyster. So there has been a massive change in consensus, not just in the last 30 years, but in the last 3 to 5 years, I'd say. Milton Friedman has been comprehensively buried. But you know all this, and yet, one of the biggest stories for us at the FT this year is about the backlash that Aron mentioned. You may agree that it's intellectually dishonest. You may question the motivations of some of the people picking holes in the sustainable business agenda, but there are holes to pick. It wouldn't be so successful if there were not some unfinished business here. And so that I think is what makes this a real story. It means that whether or not you agree with the origins of that backlash, you have to, if you are serious about sustainable business, you need some kind of answer to this. You need to reckon with it. And so what fascinates me is it's never been unusual to see people on the left distrust big business, but we now have people on the right who distrust big business. And I think a question for anybody in this world to ask is two questions. How many people have our efforts convinced, who used to hate big business? How many people have we actually won over to the idea that business can be a sustainable force for good in the world? In the meantime, how many people have we lost? How are we going to convince this new crop of doubters that what we're doing is in their interest and in the wider interest? So I do think it's a perilous time. Even beyond the noisy political headline grabbers, all of the efforts that we've been charting have not dismissed the allegations of hypocrisy, of greenwashing, of woke-washing. However well-meant the efforts, we have not run out of stories of, the planet is still warming, society is still unequal, corporate scandals still happen for all the work on governance. And so I think all this adds up to a question that Aron referenced, a word that Aron referenced, which is impact. People are not seeing enough change to back up the rhetorical shift that has certainly happened. So then there's a final point, which is all of this progress has happened in a period of booming corporate profits. Yes, there's been a pandemic to contend with, and it's pleasantly surprising to see this agenda survive the pressures of that. But we now have rapidly slowing economies. We have an energy crisis. We have war in Europe. We have a number of other pressures building, and I think there is a real question in the air about what that broader context changes. So the stakes are high. And it makes me doubly delighted to be joined by a group of panelists who I know are both sort of clear-eyed about the problems here and constructive about the potential answers to them. So let me introduce them in quick fashion. On my far left here, we have Sandra Jambo, Assistant Secretary General and CEO of the UN Global Compact. She's worked in both the public and private sectors. I think before this role, she was at Safaricom. And she leads the strategy to scale business impact on the Global Compact and the SDGs. Erica Karp, Chief Impact Officer at Pathstone, which helps steer about $40 billion worth of clients' assets. Erica's a former banker who built Cornerstone Capital, a sustainable and impact investment advisory firm, before Pathstone bought it. To her right is Martin Whitaker, another old friend of Moral Money, Chief Executive Officer of Just Capital, a leading non-profit in the stakeholder capitalism arena, whose polling gives us really valuable pointers to how those people who don't go to sustainable business conferences see sustainable business. And then finally, Rajiv Joshi, Associate Dean for Climate Action at the Columbia Climate School, my apologies. Raj is an economist and community organizer and a former managing director of the B Team. So I'm gonna start by asking you whether you think I've been too pessimistic here. I've done the journalist thing of giving you the bad news first. Sandra, do you see this more positively than I do?
I think you've given a fair view. If I was to actually answer the question behind us, if we're going to get to it, I'd say that the future of sustainable business is just going to be incredibly demanding.
Right.
Business models that we knew or have used in the past are just not business models that are going to get us where we need to go. I think the pressures and demands of a CEO in today's day and time are certainly very different, even 3 years ago. So I do think that it is, you're not overly pessimistic. I think you're just being real. Things have changed. There's huge global emergencies. We feel them. We see them no matter where you sit in the world. And I think what is the incredible opportunity, though, is actually the recognition that business does have a role to play. I think the question is, how much can business do? And this is when business really gets called to action in terms of demonstrating that profit and purpose and principles can really go hand in hand. Yeah. So I see the huge opportunity to shape that pessimism, look at it as an opportunity and make that change. The big challenge is what scale, what scope, what urgency, and really how do companies or business leaders perhaps seated here in global financial capitals in the north make those changes such that they impact the world across the board, because the future that we need is not one that's going to happen only in one corner of the world. So we need business leaders to have a long-term view and to have an inclusive view about what their business impact and decision making will do.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into the view from beyond this little island off America that we're sitting on. Erica, am I too pessimistic?
No, not at all. And I have to say, I have worked with the Global Compact for years.
Absolutely.
And I agree almost with everything that Sandha says. That said, if we think we are going to get to carbon neutral by 2050 and everything's going to be good and companies are going to do their share, we are delusional. Okay, and the reason I say that is because and by the way, I'm not a nihilist on most days, but on some days I think that humans are not long for this planet. So think about it. We are losing 1,000 species a year. So we're going to talk about the natural world. That's the reality, all right? The government says, oh, we're going to help fight inflation by throwing out some of the strategic petroleum reserve. Think about that. That entire reserve, 400 million barrels, it's like 3 weeks of our use in this country. It's nothing. It's not going to help with inflation. They're going to have to refill it. But here's the good thing. The entire fossil fuel capacity reserved, known reserves in the world, are only going to last for about 50 years. So we're kind of screwed unless we do figure out renewables, right? So I mean, these are things that are the reality. The plastics in the sea, more plastics than fishes in the next 50 years. Things are really, really bad. That said, do conscious companies, do companies that are consistent and transparent and are accountable, are those companies trying to do their share? Yes. But in the final analysis, there's a lot of blame to go around for those of us who want to consume, which apparently is the whole world. And if the emerging world starts to consume like the developed world, again, we are screwed. I apologize for using these technical terms, but that's the reality. So if we go back to economics and we think about, I'm not sure, I think this was John Maynard Keynes, who said that, the marvelous thing about economics and capitalism is that the most wickedest of men can do the most wickedest of things and say that they're helping the world. So he had a good sense of humor, but he was right. So we have to think about externalities, we have to take responsibility for them, and we have to count the cost, the financial cost of capital, right? We have to think about human capital. We have to think about natural capital. So I'm having one of those nihilistic days today, but the urgency, that fierce urgency of now, that's not enough. We don't have enough of that.
I clearly wasn't pessimistic enough, but no. Look, I agree with you about the urgency, and I think it's important to frame this discussion in that context. Martin, what would you add?
Two things. First of all, I just realized I'm wearing the same shirt as on my photograph.
Do you have others?
I do own more than one shirt, just for the record. There's a Russian proverb, Russians are famously pessimistic, and an optimist and a pessimist are speaking, and the pessimist says, oh, things are awful. Things can't get any worse. It's terrible. And the optimist says, no, you're totally wrong. Things can get a lot worse. And so I'm sort of a bit in that camp. I think things will get worse before they get better. My sense of it is that things are on a bit of a knife edge, quite honestly. Surprising to me how vulnerable the ESG community was to simple, baseless, factless attacks. Only took a couple of op-eds, and all around, everyone's, running around wondering, how can we defend the last 20 years of my career? And so I think the space has manufactured a lot of its own challenges, left it vulnerable. Second, though, grounds for optimism. You mentioned our polling. We see a lot of agreement among everyday Americans that business can and should play a much stronger role in helping create a stronger society and deal with systemic challenges that we face. And that's across political ideology, it's across age, race, gender, everything. So that's a real grounds for optimism. There's no fancy talk. We don't talk about sustainability, ESG. Obviously, we use the word just, but we talk about the underlying issues. Second, I think what comes out of this moment right now is, okay, who's actually having impact? Aron mentioned this. I think this is the work that has to be done. Which companies are actually having an impact on the underlying issues? Not say they're having an impact, but how are we measuring that actual performance? If we can do a better job of that, I think things start to fall into place. So I am, we talk about the recession and everything else, but that's sort of where I stand right now.
Yeah.
I think there's something bigger at stake here, though, which really is how business functions in society. What is the social contract? We've had a generation of one model. We're in transition to another model. And we don't know what that looks like yet. That's what we have to figure out.
I want to get I'm going to ask you each to try and define that social contract in a little moment. But Raj, just before we do that, Erica's raised the very stark stakes around climate. Are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to business action on this?
I think that we have come to a time now where the businesses that are going to make the biggest difference are those that are humble, that recognize that business leadership on this agenda is about understanding that the only way forward is through radical collaboration.
Right.
And that if we're talking about transforming our system in the time we have, for example, this decisive decade means having emissions by 2030, we need companies to work together with governments to put in place the right rules. We need civil society to hold those governments and companies accountable. We need a media that can report the truth. And if we can see business leadership that really is acknowledging the role that business has to play in society, it doesn't mean that business needs to play every single one of those roles, which is perhaps what we've seen confusing the system in terms of influencing the rules of the game. Yeah. Then perhaps we can restore the trust that has evaporated within the system to the point where now the social contract has frayed so greatly that we actually need to see, if not a revolution, a significant upheaval in principles and values. And in fact, many of those values and principles are hard to find if you look around.
Yeah, your point about the rules of the game is a kind of freighted one, given that Milton Friedman's definition of the only social responsibility of business was to make a profit, but people forget the end of that sentence, which is within the rules of the game. But if business is setting those rules...
Adam Smith, before Milton Friedman, wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Yeah.
And I think we forget that he said, how selfish soever a man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his character that interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he sees nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Yeah. And actually at the very core of economics was this notion that we do need to care for each other. And at some point we seem to have lost some of those principles.
But self-interest
I gotta say
can collide.
that that theory of moral sentiments, that it's so interesting because it's fascinating. It's consistent with a good form of capitalism, because capitalism is broken right now. And Milton Friedman, the 2 words he left out were long-term, and then he wouldn't have screwed up everything else. But by the way, I have heard the theory of moral sentiments referenced more times in the last 3 weeks than I have heard it in 10 years. That's a good thing.
That is a good thing. Okay, so just briefly sticking with my pessimism, or Martin's Russian pessimism, before we get on to more constructive subjects. Aron and I have sort of set up the perils that we see out there, from the ESG backlash to the economy, the energy crisis. Can I just ask each of you, what do you worry most about in terms of what could knock this agenda off track now? Let me mix things up and start with you, Raj.
I believe that we are at the verge of a major economic crisis. If you look at the finances of countries, if you look at the economic indicators, I do believe that the economic crisis could potentially throw the sustainable business agenda back to the Stone Age. So I think we have to be very conscious of that. Secondly, ecosystems are declining at a rate that, as Erica has pointed out, is rapid, and the business model that we have, which is based upon meeting humanity's wants, needs to very quickly evolve to one which is about meeting humanity's needs. And if we can't make that shift, I think we're going to see a consumption culture that is actually at conflict with the counterculture that we're seeing from young people coming up. And actually embracing the message that we're seeing from this next generation is something that I think companies of the future really need to take account of. And then the third thing I would say is that we are seeing a breakdown of democracy in many parts of the world. And this is not entirely disconnected from this question of the social contract. But if we can't...
Same thing.
It's the same consequence. And if we can't see a way of reconnecting citizens to this effort to build a future which really does align with our values, then there isn't going to be a playing field for business to kind of engage with. So I think this is really a time for business leadership and for the voice of business to be heard, but also for businesses to work with consumers to restore that trust.
Right. Martin, what worries are you watching out for?
Well, you're really plumbing the depths here, aren't you?
Yeah.
I would say...
I promised to get to something more uplifting soon. But,
I feel like that, an airplane in the movie when he's telling his sob story, and everyone next to him is sort of finding different ways to commit suicide. I would say 2 things: deep recession, deep extended recession, and the economic dislocation, which would perhaps lead to civic dislocation, which Raj referred to, connected to democracy. I think that when enough people think the system's not working for them, you are prey to any false prophet. And I think we have a challenge when people feel disconnected. And ultimately, that's what I meant when I talked about the social contract. So it starts with deep recession, but at the end of the, if you can't put food on the table, you don't have a job, you don't feel like anyone's in your corner, bad things happen.
yeah.
Second is, perhaps more specific, I'm curious what happens when the first public company director gets sued for breach of responsibility for pursuing an ESG agenda. That might happen. I could see that happening pretty soon.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly what law firms in New York tell me they're looking forward to.
Does everyone run for the doors?
Yeah.
Do directors who are not they don't get paid to be outspoken and courageous. They get paid to do their job and keep the ship steady. What happens when that happens?
Test of fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
Erica, would you add to that?
Just of note, because this is fascinating, and I'll stay on this governance thing, but to date, in the field of sustainability and ESG integration, this is a comment that I got from Bob Eccles, who some of you know Bob's work. He's kind of my day husband in sustainability. Bob has told me that there has not been a single instance of a lawsuit being pursued around an ESG disclosure from a company. that is what's surprising, not so much that we haven't seen a board director sued. So yeah, that's coming, but I'm not worried about that. What I am worried about, I actually think that's good, bring it. What I am worried about is that if we think about the boards of directors, the investment committees, the boards of trustees, the composition of these bodies that are the ones that are deploying investment capital, the composition of those groups, I think, is wildly problematic. So the fact that you have 60-plus-year-old white men running these investment groups, and by the way, most of them, you can look at these numbers, most of them do come from financial services. So in their mind, they've got this right. Everything's good. They're deploying capital in a fiduciary, with fiduciary responsibility, and they don't have anything to learn. So we've got a problem, and there needs to be real serious turnover of those responsible for moving capital. And that's one of the reasons capitalism is broken, short-termism. But we can fix it, that's the good part. But speaking of hubris, with these individuals managing trillions, I think Americans may have a good deal of hubris about capitalism and about democracy. So if we talk to Xi Jinping, and the US population is a rounding error when we think about China or India, but a whole view of Leninism and Marxism, like maybe that's the system. Maybe we should all learn Mandarin. Now, I don't actually believe that myself. I'm a capitalist. That said, it's hubris that really frightens me. It's hubris that will challenge our ability to follow this agenda. So, that sounds a little nihilistic. I'm really an optimist. I like to
you
argue.
okay?
So I think I am an optimist. I'm just looking around,
Okay, Sandra, the UN, you literally have to worry about everything in the world. What do you worry about?
So, three things. I mean, one has been spoken to significantly, which is just the recession and really what global economies look like at this point in time. There's countries that are sinking into bankruptcy, weighed over by debt and lending at incredible amounts that perhaps don't always get the headline, but you only need to see what happens when there's civil unrest in those countries, when you can't put your bread on the table, when you can't go to work, what that means. And it's not just about unrest in country. This spills over into regions and really drives forward a lot of discontent. So, an economic recession turns into a social, into a governance, and pulling out of that takes an incredible amount of time, energy, goodwill, etc. So that's one. I think the second for me really is about the increasing impact of politics and geopolitics on business and vice versa. I mean, spent some time talking to business leaders in September when we had our high-level week, and a couple of business leaders said to me how ill-equipped they felt to make, significant business decisions at points in time like this, because it's very clear it wasn't simply understanding what the business environment was or the competitive or the consumer environment. It was really the geopolitics was really going to shape anything you wanted to do. Are you really trying to invest in a new plant in country X? Does this make sense right now? Do you pull out of country X? What are you looking at in terms of trends, etc.? So that also, I think, is just a significant reflection point. And to your point, I think hubris is definitely not one of the sentiments that's going to help you make some of those tough decisions when politics and geopolitics are influencing how business runs. The third for me is one that I think probably consumes most of my time, which is just the lack of general solidarity and trust around the table. Yep. And it happens at a small board table because increasingly people are very polarized in what they do. And the polarization could stem, even from a level, as I say, within a company. It goes into country, it's driven by religion, it's driven by politics, it's driven by many things right now. Take that to a regional or global stage, you find the sentiment that we all see, for example, going into COP27, where one of the biggest issues is not so much whether we're going to get to the 1.5 or whatever, it's actually who's going to be at the table. Right. You have countries and delegations entering to COP extremely disillusioned that we're probably not going to even have the kind of environment where the developed world will be able to give an inch of space to the emerging and developed economies. So there's a couple of things that, not to really continue on this. I hope we're going to switch to the more optimistic bits now. But it really is grim if you're not sure, who's coming around the table and what level of disillusionment and discontent exists. So I think getting back onto a track of solidarity where people can actually see that we're in this together and moving away from more individualistic, nationalistic decisions, because we've got to get out of the climate crisis together. We've got to get out of this widening income inequality piece together. And I think that really is one of the fundamentals as well.
So you've provided one answer to my next question, which is what needs to change to make sustainable business the norm, to keep it on track, and to dispel my pessimism. Raj, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually do have a lot of hope.
Yeah.
And I think it's critical we get back to basics. I think Aron at the beginning talked about opportunity and obligation. And I think we are in a moment right now where companies that are able to get back to basics and recognize that the world is trying to figure out how do we wrestle between not just the future of business, but recognizing and coming to terms with the history of business, which is an extractive economy.
Right.
And how do we move towards a regenerative economy? And if you look at energy, for example, we know that the future of power isn't necessarily below the ground. We know that the future of power is above the ground and actually decentralized, and that when you transform power, you give people agency. And when you give people agency, you can transform social systems. And if you look at Africa, for example, where 600 million people don't have access to energy, and we're going into COP27, hopefully that may be something that we can take away at a moment in time where Europe is having one of its biggest energy crises. And if you speak to energy CEOs in Europe, they say, well, as Russia's doing deals with the East, we actually have nowhere to go other than to Africa to figure out where we can source some of the critical minerals and resources that we need to drive the energy transition in Europe. What is the social agreement that can be made between some of these geographies to try to figure out what the future of energy looks like? And then you look at the future of food systems, and we're seeing regenerative agriculture. You look at the future of textiles, and you're starting to see biomimicry, the future of buildings and cities, and you start to see that actually it is possible to shift from an economy that has kept so many of us in chains to one which really is about development as freedom. And that for me is the hope, is to see crisis and opportunity as the same thing, and actually maybe now we're at that tipping point that we actually need to shift from an economy that has held humanity back to one that enables all of us to move forward so that no one truly is left behind, as is the core of the Sustainable Development Agenda.
Erica, do you want to pick up on that?
I'm just trying to remember, there's a Chinese symbol that, crisis, opportunity.
Yeah.
Crisis is opportunity. This is why, everything Rajiv says is like, yes. You mentioned that word freedom, which is a very, very, very precious word. And I'm reminded, so in the water across the island is Roosevelt Island, the other way, east. And there's the monument there, the FDR Memorial. And I'm reminded that FDR, in his second inaugural address, gave the speech that was about the 4 freedoms. And when people ask me, capitalism and money, is it good or is it bad? And by the way, this question particularly comes from the next generation. I have 3 teenage girls, so I get lots of questions. Money is bad, capitalism is bad. No, it's not. They are tools, they are a system. And so when I think about how do I answer the question, is money good or bad? The place that I can go, the highest place I can go, is to that 4 freedoms speech. When Roosevelt talked about the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from fear, and the freedom from want. If capitalism can increase those, can serve those, It is so good. It's the best system the world has ever known for creating prosperity. If an economic and financial system diminishes those freedoms, then that's where capitalism and money are bad. So from the highest level, that's how I try to think of what our values are. And by the way, there is a difference. I mean, moral money, there is a difference between morals and ethics and values. And as an investor, as an investment advisor, it's not my job to put my values on our clients and their money. It is my job to advise and to support. And hopefully, quietly, and in a way that makes people just the right amount of uncomfortable, hopefully, we can elevate consciousness. But again, that distinction between morals and how we pick our values and ethics in terms of how companies behave in our system, these are things we really have to think about. And if we can definitely think about this in the context of freedom, then we can love capitalism, because this next generation, they do not. Quite the opposite. And when you talk about what's another thing that we have to worry about, if we can't sell it, then again, to use the technical term, we are screwed. So.
Martin.
We should get our kids together. They'd have a lot of fun about capitalism. I think, so my colleagues here have used very high, sort of soaring language and ideas. So I'll try and be more practical to add to that. When I was younger in my career and I wanted to have a big impact on the world, as you do, my boss said, Martin, follow the money. And so let's follow the money. So money follows opportunity, or at least it follows perceived opportunity. And I think about data driving that. So when I was at Swiss Re, climate was a big economic issue. That's why it was a big environmental issue, of course, but pursued it as a reinsurer because it was an economic risk, an unfunded liability. To do that properly, you have to have good data. We need more, better, more believable, more meaningful data and research around how creating value for stakeholders creates value for shareholders. That is the central argument of the pushback. It's a zero-sum game. Either I pay my workers a living wage, or I buy back my own shares, or I return capital to investors. The one comes out of the other's pocket. That's a false narrative, as Aron alluded to right at the beginning. So there are many false narratives here, but the opportunity that, I did an interview around the climate transition recently, and one of the questions was, well, which stakeholders matter a lot in that climate transition? And I really focused on the worker because I believe employees of companies now hold so much influence and can be conveyors of a believable message that we should empower them with this opportunity set that's being created by transition, in that case, to a low carbon economy, but more broadly, transition to a marketplace that works for more people. So I'm a realist. I think the things that draw that much tighter connection between capital and impact, as I'd mentioned earlier. And then I think a groundswell, a popular movement. This is one of I talked earlier about our polling. It has to be socially unacceptable for a company to pay its CEO, 20,000 times the average worker. When Bob, or whoever Bob is, walks into a room, if other CEOs go, that's not cool, then it becomes kind of a little tricky to sort of get away with that. And I think this level setting of what defines success, what are the norms of business behavior and leadership behavior, and if that can become a popular movement around this idea of stakeholder value creation, that's my belief, is we shift from a shareholder primacy to a stakeholder model, where shareholders win, by the way. They don't lose in that model, they win. That is the key. But that only happens if there's some sort of tie back to how most people feel the system is working for them.
So, not to put words in your mouth, but every time I look at Just Capital's surveys of what people think just capitalism looks like, what they prioritize most, the number one priority for them is, do you pay your workers a fair wage, isn't it?
Has been for years, and this year became way more pronounced.
Right. So it's a bottom-up thing. We've talked in very lofty terms about capitalism here, but it's kind of, are you delivering for the people you employ is the sort of number one
Correct.
preoccupation. Yeah. I just want to throw in another question here. A lot of the sustainable business story and the stories we write about it are really about voluntary corporate action, often defined by people who say that, well, we're having to take voluntary action because governments are failing, they're distrusted, and if you really wanted to save the whale right now, you wouldn't stand outside Congress with a placard, you'd stand outside JP Morgan's annual meeting with a placard, and you get quicker results and probably better results. But Sandra, how do you see what balance are we going to need between business and government, civil society and other players to get this right, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to be a delicate balancing act, but I do really feel, as I said earlier, the fact that right now, politics, geopolitics, business is so intertwined. Yeah. I think there definitely does need to be some form of reset. I am one of those who perhaps optimistically really thinks that business leaders should not have to fall too much into regulation to behave well. As has been said, I mean, we just need to get to the stage where some things are not cool. It's just not cool to do this. I wanted to add on a little bit to the freedom piece and say, not only should capital give freedom, but it should also allow dignity and choice. Right. And I think when you take those words down to that level, then you really get into, what is this decision that I make? How does it really impact this other person that I might not see? The guy on the shop floor, the pregnant mom who does really deserve time off, the worker who's clocking lots of hours beyond that. So, and I think that also will then help decide, what are the things that we really need to regulate? And I think there's things that we need to regulate because there's urgencies and we really can't get our acts together. But on the other hand, I think that, we do need to get to the sense where leadership is really about just making the right decisions for yourself, for your business, for your community, your customers, and your citizenry. So I think it has to be a balance. I wouldn't swing, either or on the two areas. But I do also see the need for, tables where regulation is set to have a really strong business business component to it, business participation, because I think that sometimes we run the risk of over-regulating ourselves out of situations, situations that then tend to exclude. They'll exclude small businesses that drive a lot of the American economy. They'll exclude women who can't always access capital. They'll exclude a whole group of people. So I think representation is critical when we're looking at policy setting and regulation, but at the same time, I think regulation also needs to make sense, not just for governments, but also for businesses in many ways. That said, I think the types of crises we have right now and the lack of solidarity and trust may, to some extent, precipitate places where we do need to have some sort of huge push to get things going. And I think, climate is one of them, and we're seeing a lot of action towards that. But, my position would be, I think we need to get to the stage where business leaders are a lot more conscious, leaders as a whole, a lot more conscious about what we need to do for society as a whole.
Raj, you want to pick up on the climate point? I mean, can we trust business to do this, take this action voluntarily, or do we need a firmer public policy framework to?
Personally, I think that we've had a race to zero. We have a race to resilience that needs to go faster and deeper, but we do need a race to regulation. And truthfully, as an economist, I don't think you'll find an economist in the world that doesn't agree that markets fail at some times, that there aren't distributional effects in markets, that the marginal propensity to consume of low-income families is much higher than those of higher-income families. And right now we have a situation where most of the wealth sits with a very small number of people, and therefore there's a very limited amount of growth that can happen in the economy. And so we need to think about the fundamentals of this economic system. And it's not about walking away from economics. In fact, it's about working towards economics and recognizing what we've done is we've been deciding to pick and choose from economic theory in order to benefit the few, not the many. And actually, we need an economic system that actually reflects our science. And as a social scientist, I think what we really need is to provide greater power to economic thinkers and policymakers to ensure that our policies reflect that science.
Right. Yeah. Erica, Martin, do you want to pick up on that, or should we?
See,
Go ahead.
here's where I get optimistic. So I think, first of all, I do think capitalism is beautiful. I think economics is poetry, right? And I think that great companies, sustainable companies, are innovative and resilient and show higher growth, right? And turn out to be better investments over the long run. And so I think that right now, we are potentially at a place where we can have a Cambrian explosion of innovation, right? And corporate profitability for companies that are creative, all right? There's enough capital, there's enough technology, we have everything we need to drive a really progressive, inclusive future. But we have to unleash creativity. And so when it comes to boards of directors, I actually do think it is their job to more than just do their jobs and watch over stuff. I think boards should be kind of hired and let go and created with the idea of, innovation and creativity. And I really, really do think that that can happen. And so we are poised, and by the way, on the economic front, I'm actually probably more optimistic. I think our system right now, the financial systems, are holding up incredibly well in light of the fact that this is the first time in history that purposefully the global economy was shut down. That has never happened. And the extent of the resilience that we have seen, the extent to which our economic system has held up, I think is extraordinary. And so that's great. And so I think we are poised to find an explosion of creativity and innovation. We just have to make sure that we do have a regulatory environment that boosts that, right? And so look at the, IRA. There's a lot of good stuff in this Inflation Reduction Act. So I think we're poised to potentially do amazing things. Now, it is back to that idea of, do we have the force of will? Do we have, frankly, the energy and the consciousness? And so this is like, there's a beautiful, we're just coming out of the days of awe in the Jewish high holidays. And there's this one prayer, it's my favorite of the Jewish prayers. It's called Hashkivenu. And basically, one of the thinkings behind it is, may I lie down at night in peace. May I not make a gain by another's loss. I mean, that's a beautiful thing, right? And this is where we can have an understanding that we can grow the pie for everyone. Inclusive growth, a regenerative and a just transition. That's where it's at. So, yes, that was me in a good mood.
Great definition of sustainable business, Martin.
Love the word of the use of the word just as well. Keep doing that. I would say, listen, unleashing that creativity though, that requires incentives.
Yes.
And certainly government, which is really the question right here, is about government versus, incentive versus rules.
Yeah.
Government versus private sector. And I think government sets the rules of the game, no question. Markets are among the most heavily regulated areas there is. But unleashing that creativity only happens when you have the incentives. Mm-hmm. And you cannot regulate your way to the American dream. So you have to have, you have to have the right policies, intelligent policies that can provide the floor, perhaps, of what's expected. But I think, I agree with you, I think that kind of incentive, and I've not found in the companies that we work with any lack of desire, motivation, or incentive to be better on investing in workers or environment or local communities or other stakeholders. Where I find companies needing help is like on the how. How do I actually do this? And typically, there's a hero story inside every company of someone who has overcome barriers. And I think I don't find companies share those stories enough. I'm sure Aron and BSR do a great job of trying to connect those dots, but I think I'd like to see a lot more cooperation between companies on the how. How do you get there from here? I think that will accelerate a lot. I'm pessimistic about government playing an informed role in the transition to a stakeholder economy right now. I don't see it happening. B, I don't see any interest in the left or the right in it happening. So this is why I look at the company and I say, okay, well, what's in it for you then? What's in it for an employer today who sees the opportunity in climate action, who knows that human capital is the single greatest source of value for their business, who cares deeply about their customers and the changing values, tastes, and preferences that they have, accessing new markets, and who recognizes that their roots in the communities, virtual and physical, that they serve, is really what is providing them with a competitive advantage. Like that's a leader that I want to invest in and get behind. And we don't have that narrative sufficiently well developed yet.
I want to give people in the room the opportunity to throw a couple of questions at the panel. Does anybody want to ask any questions to our panelists? We've got a microphone here, and if you just let us know your name and whether you want to direct your question at any one panelist.
To everybody. I'm Jay Frank with Symbiotic, and I hear a lot of movement and change, but I don't hear about anything towards degrowth in the world.
So I think that's an amazing question. And so the fact that we talk about, GDP growth and earnings growth, especially when it's quarter over quarter, I think it's dreadful. And so I think that it is anathema in the markets to say that we're going to grow more slowly, but more thoughtfully and more, really more thoughtful for the long run. So I think it's great. And I think we have not figured out a way to be okay. The closest we've come is like a Paul Pullman, saying that, if you want to, or in, with Apple, right? If you are thinking about short-term profitability, don't buy my company. We have it there in both. But the idea of finding a way to find incentives, that's what Martin said, that's going to be the trick. Now, incentives here, this is a very long conversation if we want, but they can be external. They can be from the government, they can be from a corporate profitability. But I think the most powerful leaders, they are incentivized from inside, right? And so we have to figure out how we can incentivize people knowing that it's not just about growth in terms of profits and revenues and such. So, and we have so many other crises that we're not talking about. We're not talking about this huge mental health crisis in the world, which detracts from the ability to be internally incentivized. We're not talking about the crisis of education, which is probably the single most important thing long-term if we're going to help people be incented from the inside. So I love the aspiration. Who is it? Patagonia, right? Buy less stuff. Just buy the best stuff. Like, that's cool. So I think we've gone nowhere near even a dialogue about what you're talking about, which I think is really unfortunate. And if we talk about, government regulation, we don't even have conversations about, consumption tax. Can we please just have the conversation about a consumption tax? I don't even know why we don't have it. But there are so many incentives that are just about growth. Really, thank you for asking the question.
Can I just ask a twist on that question, which is it socially responsible for a company to still be increasing its profit margins at a time of high inflation? Or would the socially responsible thing to do say, sorry, we can't make as much profit this year. Otherwise, we're going to be screwing our customers, to use to coin a phrase. But
It depends. That's a real, it depends. We can have like a whole hour plus on this conversation. For the most part, on face, it looks like they're gouging. How can they do that? That's incredibly irresponsible. But I could make the other side of the argument too, for some companies, right? So the answer is, it depends.
I think if I could I add to
Yeah,
that? Because
Sandra.
I love the concept of degrowth. I wonder how the concept of also relevant growth sits with you. Because I think, degrowth is great, but no company is an island. So if a company slows down, there goes with it a supply chain, there goes with it, SMEs and livelihoods. I think to your question of, can companies make profits at times like this? I agree, it depends. If the growth is relevant. If you're a company that is continuing to make profits, but you continue to add value in society, you could be doing low-cost urban housing that helps address the homeless crisis. You could be looking at, pharmaceuticals that are more affordable, accessible, etc. So it goes back to, I guess, business purpose and how and why you're growing as well. So the degrowth, I think it's a fantastic, concept to think about, but I would encourage more also just the relevant type of growth that isn't purely on the back of pure consumerism that continues to drive these widening divides. But there's a lot of things where private sector can provide a lot of relevant solutions that are consumer driven but are also incredibly value adding to society. And I think we need to do a lot more of that to be able to bridge a lot of the divides that we see.
Yeah,
By the way, Martin,
I will just say
he does have more than this. Is not his only shirt. This actually is my only shirt, and it's because I believe that if we're going to be degrowth and profitable and progressive, we need to wear our clothing until it actually disappears. Right, so I am not a consumer, as you can tell, and this is my only shirt. A shame on you.
I do have
Where's
two
it
shirts.
from?
I have two shirts. I'm
What
sorry.
brand is it?
I think it's growth for whom, and who. Like your question on profits is all about value. It's about value creation. Who does benefit? Why there are many people right now who are struggling to make ends meet. 100 million plus Americans. If you're in a job, you're probably working. If you're working 3 jobs. You're trying to put your kids through college, you're trying to save. It's tough to talk about degrowth, but you can have a conversation about how we grow. I would think about it more like that. But anyway, it's obviously a long question.
I would just say it's about balanced growth. I think that 60,000 Americans don't have access to electricity. Who are we to say that those communities should not grow and receive what they need? 600 million Africans don't access to electricity. I think it's easy to have some countries climb a ladder of growth and then kick the ladder down. I think what we really need to do is think carefully about employment where it's most needed. And at the same time, I think how do we define growth is the biggest question that we have. GDP, I think, is the biggest constraint we have in how we think about growth. And I think the fact that Costa Rica and Scotland and New Zealand and other countries have become well-being economies and are looking at well-being economy indicators around growth, which is about mental health, and it's about all of the other things that make our lives fulfilling and enable us to thrive as a people, which is about our ecosystems and everything else. The real question now, I think, is about whether GDP is the correct metric of human development, and actually whether we can start to move beyond these indicators that perhaps are too simplistic for the kind of world that we need to build, which has to balance human needs and the needs of the ecosystem on which all life depends.
Maybe in the business setting we need to be talking about well-being as well as growth there. Can I just squeeze in a question here? Again, there's a microphone on its way to you, just at the back.
Good morning, and thank you very much. And you mentioned Paul Pullman. So a net positive, his book, he's got this chapter 6, verse 4, 1 + 1 = 11. So if everyone on the board, including Andrew, how do you see that as part of our opportunity set to go forward? Where synergies, where 1 + 1 = 11, that's a funny math. But if you understand his premise and thought process, I think we've all. And what's your favorite book today, please? Each of you.
I should throw this to the panel for. I don't know. I mean, look. I think Paul. I think the net positive argument is a very it's a very very plausible, constructive one. I think when I set up Moral Money, as Gillian said, I used to joke that our biggest challenge was to get to paragraph 3 of an article without mentioning Paul Pullman, because he was sort of one of only a handful of CEOs we could think of who were really so personifying what we were writing about. And I think one of the great advantages of one of the great signs of progress is we can all think of more than just Patagonia and Paul Pullman now. At the same time, I find it very hard to think of a company which really kind of is sort of ticking the box on all of the chapters in that book.
But wait. Let's talk about BASF. All right. So they make chemicals, and everyone's like, chemicals terrible. Let me tell you something. We all would not be clothed. We wouldn't have any transportation to get here. We wouldn't have anything. We wouldn't have wine, but for chemicals. BASF is a highly sustainable company, right? So we can talk about their CEO. A.P. Miller-Maersk, travel and shipping, and just what Adam Smith would talk about in terms of understanding the circumstances of others. That's the oceans, the seas. Maersk is a highly sustainable company. So we can think of loads of companies in many ways. Amazon, highly sustainable company. In many ways, people despise Amazon. Are you guys in the room? Apologies. But that's true. So trade-offs is something we have to come to terms with.
Their customers don't despise them.
Right?
Yeah.
That's obviously it, right? So trade-offs are huge in terms of our thinking around, what tobacco companies, Philip Morris.
If I could throw out one example there, this week I saw that Philip Morris is shipping free cigarettes to the soldiers on the front lines in Ukraine.
Right.
And now is that ESG?
By the way, everything is ESG, everything. And so when it comes to investors who are willing to buy Philip Morris, we know they're moving towards not burning tobacco, which is what gives you cancer. So the question is an investor willing to go with Philip Morris in terms of the pace and magnitude of their transformation? Most people would say no. Some people would say yes. And they still consider themselves sustainable investors being long Philip Morris. So there are not definitives. There are trade-offs. Yeah. And each company has to decide how to hold itself responsible.
We're in grave danger of cutting into the next panel's time. So I just wanted to ask a really big question and ask you to answer it in really short form. A couple of you have raised the notion of a social contract. The part of what we're struggling with here is that we haven't really defined what the proper place of business is in addressing our big social and environmental and global challenges. What do you think that social contract needs to look like? I think, Martin, you mentioned this. Can you kind of define that for us?
Well, I go back to J&J's credo. I go back to some of the initial blue book of General Electric, which talked about, this is back in the founding days of the organization, talked about the acting in the balanced best interest of all stakeholders. I think it's reflected in the stakeholder vision of value creation for planet, employees, customers, communities. I wish Business Roundtable would double click on that and actually explain what that means and how to do it. But that's what I think. And the book I'm reading, by the way, is David Gell. It's The Man Who Broke Capitalism, like Jack Welch.
Yeah. Former FT colleague of mine. Raj, I know you've been thinking about this too.
Yeah, I was once at the Jack Welch Management Institute, although I'm an activist. I've been thinking hard about this, and I know that the trade unions have been working on this agenda for decades, and Sharon Burrow is doing so much critical work on this agenda. The SG also just made a terrific speech about this. I think that this question is really elevating. The question on the mind, I think, of young people today is, where is the economic security that we're going to need?
Right.
And if you look at countries like Japan, for example, which had principles around lifetime employment, where the employer was taking care of you from the beginning you walked in the door until the moment that you, as an elder, would walk out of the door. Some of those core values and principles, some of which I think we can embrace from the East, need to find their way, I think, into the West. And perhaps that's the opportunity of this moment that we're in, when the geopolitics are evolving, that there's a lot in the values of other parts of the world that we can actually integrate, which is about looking after each other and the planet and And that contract that needs to be negotiated, it is also a social process. And I think that what we're going to start to see is the participatory processes happening at a country level all over the world to negotiate a just transition. In order to do that, we need a new social contract.
Okay. So,
Can I give you
Erica,
a book?
very quickly.
Just a book. It's called Ministry for the Future. And so it's an interesting book as it relates to, object lessons from climate change and potential paths forward. Some of you, it will become more optimistic. Some of you will not by reading the book. But that's what I'm in the midst of right now.
Sandra, do you want the last word?
As we sit around to renegotiate the social contract, we probably need to have a different group of actors at the table. Those who negotiated the past ones should definitely not be the ones negotiating the future. That would be my take.
Tremendous. Well, we have. I feel more optimistic than when I started, surprisingly. But we've hit on cooperation, transparency, the need for incentives, values, long-termism. Surprisingly, we've hit on Leninism and shirts as well. I think that tells you how eclectic and brilliant this panel was. I can't thank you enough. And let me invite Aron back. But thank you all.
Thank you all. That was just fantastic. And while we're doing a little bit of changing on the stage here, two things. One, to the point of degrowth, the next in our 30th anniversary series in Paris is going to be a debate set up almost like a court trial on that concept. So it's not sustainable to suggest everyone should hop on a plane to go there. The dollar's quite strong against the euro, so and then we've done some work on social contract. Have a look on our website. We've got a paper that outlines what we think a 21st century social contract ought to look like. I hope you might find it interesting as well. With that, I see my friend Ari Wallach. Come on up, Ari. And while he's making his way up, Ari embodies the multi-hyphenate person.
Which side do you want?
Why don't you go there?
Thanks.
That's right. Multi-hyphenate. He's an author. This book we'll talk about. That's just out recently. A professor, a futurist, a consultant, and probably many other things.
Father.
Father as well. Thank you. An ancestor, which is a word I'll come back to in a minute. So, and Ari has worked with business, with government, with NGOs, academic settings. So I think we're going to jump now into the future because I mentioned Ari is a futurist. Here is his new book, Longpath, Becoming the Great Ancestors, Our Future Needs. So I want to start with the title and subtitle of the book. Tell us about the book and how you think about being a great ancestor.
First of all, thanks for having me. I was thinking about on the way in here, I realized I actually spoke at a BSR event like 20 years ago, kind of at the very, very beginning of my career. So it's great to kind of be back here for your 30th. So as Aron said, for 20 years, I've been working with very large organizations, Fortune 10, 15, the UN, the White House, the State Department, helping them think about the future. But what I came to realize about 5 or 6 years ago was the way they were thinking about the future was very much around kind of a zero-sum way of doing it. So they were bringing me and my team in to basically help them win the future vis-a-vis somebody else. So it was help us think about where transportation is going or chemicals or national security in a way that will allow us to be in front of whoever else is in our sector. And I realized, probably later than most of you, that was not going to be, it's like it's the Marshall Goldsmith, like what got you here won't get you there. And so that type of thinking about the future that got us to this certain point, if we think about kind of professional futuring as maybe about 50 years old, that's not going to be what moves us forward through a just transition. It's great coming right after this last panel because a lot of what the panel was talking about, both in terms of issues and policies and ideas, I realized are part and parcel of the conversation that we have to be having. What I became frustrated with was we were not having those conversations, and I was trying to think about why were we not having those conversations? And as someone who's worked in politics, I've worked for most presidential campaigns also, and what I realized is more often than not, the way we will talk about it is through a very kind of short-termistic lens, right? So obviously, I don't have to tell this crowd, it's quarterly earnings, or it's the next election cycle, or maybe 12, 18 months out. And actually, when I gave a TED Talk on this 5 years ago,
I gave a story when I walked into the office of an unnamed Fortune 9, maybe that's naming them, CEO, and he said, great, the futurist is here. We're ready to talk about the future. I'm ready to go really far out. I'm ready to go out like maybe 18 months. And I realized at that point we had an issue, and we had to get kind of at the underlying problem set before we go forward. So the subline in the book is an antidote to short-termism. And so I was really trying to think about how do we overcome short-termism, not necessarily in a top-down way, because we know the policies, we know the regulations, we know different ways of kind of tackling that. What I was trying to find, and Erica touched on this earlier, is what are the internal incentive structures that we need? So the book is called Longpath, Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs. And in the title, you kind of get an idea of where I'm going with the book, which is how do we help people realize we are not on the tail end of something. We are not at the, at the tail end of, let's say, the Homo sapien experiment, right? In many ways, we've only been at it in this way about 10,000 years, 10, 12,000 years since the switch to hunter-gatherer to agricultural revolution. So if we're really at the actually very beginning of it, how do we act? What are the incentives that we need? So I flipped it from us being descendants, which is the way we often think about where we are in the temporal span of our reality right now, to actually realizing we're actually at the very, very beginning. And so the book is really about how do we become great ancestors across the board. And going back to the introduction, that's in business, that's in policy, politics, parenting, national security, what have you. The book was really designed to kind of make us have a mindset shift as opposed to a set of just kind of top-down solutions, because I'd read all those books and found them lacking.
Great. So one of the things that won me over early on in the book was when you were talking about how we're living in what you call an intertidal age, a transitional period. I think that's 100% right, whether you look at the industrial consumption and production economy, or maybe more recently, the 30 or so years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Those eras are ending. Yep. Or you could also say the era driven by fossil fuels. Those eras are ending. What is coming next is not entirely clear. So you point to these as intertidal eras.
Yeah.
Tell us how you think about that.
I'm not a marine biologist, but I've spoken to many. So the intertidal, as you all know, you've all been on a shore, probably somewhere at some point in your life, where you kind of were on a piece of land that at one point in time is either underwater or is above water. That's the intertidal zone, right? That's this kind of shifting between what is and what could be. And we know the Gramsci quote, what has been is dying, what is yet to come is yet to be born. And in that in-between, that interregnum, what I call an intertidal, is a moment both of kind of complexity and chaos, but also massive opportunity. So the question is, and I'll refer back to Erica again, do we want to think of ourselves at a point that is more like a Cambrian explosion in terms of innovation and moving forward? Or do we want to see ourselves like 65 million years ago when there was a massive great extinction after the asteroid hit the Gulf of Mexico? We're really in some ways at that point. And actually, it was to Mark's point, this idea of kind of being on a knife edge. Most intertidals are always kind of on the knife edge. All the animals that exist in there are always just about to make it, or maybe not going to make it, but it's really about the creativity that is incumbent on the players in the intertidal zone. So yes, it's kind of the end of a fossil fuel era, but I put this intertidal on par with what we had moving from kind of really the Copernican revolution. So thinking about moving from the Middle Ages through this idea that not everything revolves around the Earth, not everything revolves around humans per se. And as we move into an integrated systems approach and a systems way of thinking in this new era where humans are not, it's not incumbent upon us to rule over the Earth and the land and dominion, but actually to be part of a system and understand where we're going to fit within these regenerative systems, that's this intertidal moment. And I think a couple of other people said this on the previous panel, what happens in that moment of chaos also kind of reverberates politically, how people act. So in these kind of transition moments where people start to see no official future, right? Because a big part of how we operate as Homo sapiens, the big part of how our limbic system works, is we need to have a sense of what tomorrow is going to bring. We've been like that for about, depends when you talk to, 10 to 15,000 years. When that official future collapses, we get very short-term focus. We get laser focus. It's in almost every mammal does this. And so you see this in all of our systems. So what we see in an intertidal is both the potential to move to, let's say, a liquid democracy movement like Taiwan, or to arise.
Say what you mean about a liquid
democracy, where people are able to kind of vote, and it's no longer kind of the classic representative system that we've had for 200 plus years in this country, where people are much more engaged as citizens and are voting electronically and are much a part of kind of citizen assemblies and thinking about budgeting and much more integrated into policy creation. Or there's a rush to authoritarianism and fascism and kind of the alpha leader who says, don't worry, I have an official future, even if that official future is going backwards towards a retrofuturism, which we've had in this country 4 years ago and maybe moving forward. So the intertitle, again, is this pivotal moment. And the Longpath, you shouldn't think of it. There was a review of Longpath where someone said, well, it's a great book, but he doesn't provide us all the answers. Mm-hmm. Longpath isn't about answers. It's about a mindset. It's a way of kind of navigating the intertitle so that at the end, we kind of navigate it successfully in a way where where we're able to kind of co-create the futures that we want as opposed to having the future wash over us. So kind of a key component of Longpath is recognizing that the future is not a noun. It's not this thing that's out there. It's very much a verb. It's very much something that we do constantly in our actions. Some of those actions are like the Paris agreements. Some of them are how we interact with our colleagues or with our children. But wherever you kind of slide on that scale, that's future making. So, someone else is like, oh, you're going to put all the futurists out of business if everyone thinks they can do this. You're right, everyone can do this. This isn't necessarily a rocket science in a certain way. Yes, scenario planning, some of the methodologies that we use are complex, and you've all kind of probably done the off-sites. What I'm arguing for is a different way of thinking in this intertidal moment that allows us to move forward justly towards the world that we want. And one last thing, a key component of that, and this kind of came up at the very end of the last panel, is we have to start having a conversation about what is that world that we want. It can't just be about sustainability or sustaining this, because we know this isn't working. If we look at the Edelman Trust Institute, if we look at where people are right now on the planet, wherever they are in the socioeconomic system or spectrum, they don't believe in the systems that we have. So if we are going to rebuild it, we have to recognize, we have to meet people where they are in a way that allows them to decide the futures that they want, as opposed to the ones that are kind of top-down driven, which is how, truth be told, we've been operating for several decades now.
So you talk a lot about intergenerational empathy in the book, and also, if I'm remembering correctly, empathy for past generations, and I found that really interesting. So what's a practical example maybe about how we can have empathy for what's come before, even as we think that what's come before should no longer guide us?
Yep.
And think about empathy for, to take the Native American approach 7 generations forward, which you mentioned that in the book as well.
So I talk about a little bit about this in the book, and it's kind of a personal example. So my father was born in Europe in the 1920s, and his family was put into the Jewish ghetto in Poland. He eventually escaped, where most of his family did not survive. And he made his way after the war to Cuba, to Mexico, where I was born, and eventually to the States. And so you may think I'm going to go to a business example, but I'll make it very grounded and personal. I, like most of us, probably are like, oh, and especially now as a parent, I'm like, oh, I wish my parents would have done X or Y differently. They were amazing, but sometimes I have issues with the way they did certain things in my upbringing. The fact of the matter is, I guarantee you right now, my children will say the same thing about me, and their children will say the same thing about them. So transgenerational empathy is about understanding that it's not about letting anyone off the hook, but it's about understanding we're doing the best we can at any given moment. And what I've found specifically, and why it's about going into the past is so important, I've found it's been very difficult, and I've been in boardrooms, and I've been in the Situation Room, and a whole bunch of other places where people say, well, the reason everything is so messed up is because they did it before us, and they messed it up, but we're going to do it right. And if you don't have a certain level of kind of humbleness and gratitude for where you are and what those went through to get you to this point, it's going to be very difficult to lay out strategies to get us to the far tomorrows that we want if you think you are going to do it perfectly. So that's why the book, and that's why the mindset starts with empathy for the past and recognizing they did what they did with what they could and where they are, and it's incumbent upon us to do the same and not assume we'll be perfect at doing it.
Great. Let's maybe bring it down, as you advise companies and NGOs and governments. Everyone in the room wants to go back and say, how can I apply some of the principles that you're speaking to? What are some ways that you've seen these principles put into action, and what advice would you give to people to take this way of thinking forward in organizations that, let's face it, are experiencing so many pressures today that they may not actually be open to hearing about this?
We're working with organizations right now, both governmental, non-governmental, and corporate, who are under extreme pressure right now. And so I don't want to be Pollyannish about it and say, well, you have to walk into the boardroom and say, we're not acting like great ancestors. Get rid of all of our product, get rid of everything. That's not going to work. What does work is when we think of ourselves in those decision-making moments, partly to think of ourselves as proxy for future generations. And the question is, how do you do that? So when I transitioned from my company being a kind of for-profit consulting to what we are right now, to kind of much more hybrid, so we can work with a lot of different organizations, our kind of key funder asked me a very simple question. If those who are alive in 2116, so this was 100 years out, a couple years ago, could go back and hire a consulting firm to help other organizations better meet their needs so that they can flourish, what would that firm do? So that's how Longpath Labs was born. So the question is, how do you do that in your own setting? Here's a very simple thing. It's kind of it's somewhat ripped from Amazon, but we've been using it, and it's very simple.
We won't tell them.
No, you won't tell them. Next time you're in any sort of meeting, and leave an empty chair. What does that empty chair represent? Well, at Amazon, the empty chair was always representing the customer. So what does she want? What does she need? Now, that may be same-day delivery, which has pros and cons, right? We've talked a little bit about that. The empty chair for being a great ancestor, is for future generations, whatever that means to you. So that could be 20 years out, that could be 50 years out, that could be 100 years out. And ask yourself, as we're about to make this decision, small or big, so if it's very big, have an empty chair. If it's a smaller decision, it's a mental empty chair. What do they need to maximize their ability to flourish in their lifetime? How will this decision impact them? It's a very, very simple exercise. The book is full of exercises, but that's the one I can tell you right now that's very simple. We've been using it. It sounds kind of hokey. It's not, because all of a sudden you start shifting how you make decisions. And I can't remember who said it before in the previous panel. It may lead to less margin in the short term, but the question of how we measure what success is over the long term, so that's hundreds if not thousands of years, forces us to have to kind of shift how we define success. Leaving that empty chair is one way of doing that.
And on a commercial basis, there isn't a company anywhere that doesn't want to figure out how to make its offerings sticky by making them relevant and appealing to future generations.
And by the way, it's not just future generations. We just polled 50 CEOs and said, what are the two things that you are most concerned about over the next 10 to 15 years? They said two things: climate change, and they said employee recruitment and retention. Specifically around.
So can we get the mics? We've got a live stream going, so.
I can keep yelling. I don't know if they can hear me because
Yeah. Let's go to the hand mic. Why not?
Sure. The other things about doing this is that you're very adaptable. Is this good? Nope.
No.
Hello?
Oh, doesn't seem there.
Anything working?
Yeah.
I realize I'm eating into your cookie and cake time. I'm sorry. I'll wrap this up quickly.
All right. Thank you, and thanks for your patience.
All right, where were we?
You surveyed 50
We surveyed 50.
CEOs.
So the two things they were most focused on was employee retention and climate change and recruitment. Specifically around Gen Z, we've done internal polling at organizations. I can't say which ones. When we say, the product or the business that you're working on is going to positively impact future generations going out to the year 2200, how does this make you feel? It's off the charts. And this isn't about kind of PR or branding. This is actually a true exercise because people want that level of transparency and purpose that goes just beyond the current moment. Yes, when we think about kind of social justice policies that we're trying to implement, it's important to do those in the current temporal moment. But we have found when organizations are willing to put out that they're actually part of something much, much bigger, part of like a larger Homo sapien project on a flourishing planet Earth, people get very, very excited.
Let me ask you one last question. The book is going to be adapted for a series on public television in the United States, I think next year.
PBS next year, yeah.
Not everyone in the audience is in the U.S.
So even if you're not in the U.S., that's okay because there's global rights being sold, so don't worry. So the show is going to be called A Brief History of the Future. And I'm the host, shockingly. And what we're doing is we're moving back and forth between the current moment and the kind of larger issues that were brought up on the panel earlier, and then showing what those look like in the 2040s and 2050s and 2060s when we've successfully scaled these kind of protopian ideas. So one thing I want to leave you with is, we know what dystopia is.
Protopian might not be familiar to
So we
everyone.
know what dystopia is. It's the end of the world. We know what utopia is, which is actually a dystopia that eventually falls in on itself. Protopia is a term from Kevin Kelly in 2011, which is about tomorrows that are better than today, right? It's about working towards something bigger and better so that the future generations are able to kind of flourish in a positive way. So really what we'll be doing in this show is looking at kind of small scale things. So by the way, if your company or your organization is working on something really cool and you think, wow, in 30 years, if this is fully scaled out, it will lead to a much better tomorrow, let me know, because those are the things we're going to be doing. We're going to be trying to traveling around the world. It'll be companies, products, different kind of, like I said, liquid democracy in Taiwan, different food systems. And again, because a big part of kind of Longpath, and I've touched on this earlier, is people need to see a vision of what success looks like. You can say, oh, we're going to do X and Y and things are going to be better, but until, and the neuroscience is in the book, until people see a felt emotional connection to a vision of what it will look like, they are not going to move. We've seen that in various lab experiments and also in the real world. So the show is our way of showing, look, it's not all doom and gloom. We actually do make it, and this is what it looks like when we've made it successfully in all these different areas across all these episodes. So that's what the show is.
It's fantastic, and I think it's something that we sometimes struggle with because this community can be very good at doom and gloom. Nihilism, in fact, as Erica said, and so I think painting that picture is crucial. I have heard a rumor that if your organization wants to buy some books, that you can get an hour with Ari talking about this in greater detail. So it's a great book, and you know, buy some books, get Ari free. So why not? Anyway, Ari, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Really, really interesting stuff. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Let's see if that's working. Yes. So I am delighted to invite up to the stage David Opdyke, who will be the last presenting for the last portion of our time today. David is a visual artist who is focusing on climate and other ways in which we are not taking good care of nature. David has been has shown at Museum of Modern Art here in Manhattan, Brooklyn Academy or Brooklyn Art Museum, and many other places that I'm not remembering right now, but many other places. And he's from Schenectady, New York. So David, he's going to show us some oh, David, yes, I haven't met David until just now. David, come on up, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing your work.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Just going to get my speaker notes up. Whoops, don't do that. There we go. Great, okay. All right, thanks for the invitation, first of all. Thank you to BSR, and thank you for all sticking around. This is not my usual gig, I guess I'd say. I'm much more accustomed to doing things with art students at museums and galleries and things like that, and this is a really interesting opportunity for some, I don't know, some cross-pollination, I guess I'd say. So I'm mindful of the sort of the uniqueness of this situation, so thank you for that too. All right, so, oh right, and also like just sort of, this is why I have my notes. Also, this work that we're looking at right now, it's called Someday All This, is also in a unique context right now. It's in a pop-up in Soho in a storefront, temporary thing, and it's sponsored by the Climate Museum. So this is also a very different kind of context in that the work itself is just part of climate activism kind of incubator is what they call it. I'll get into that a little bit later. So I'm doing several new things at once. It's very exciting. All right. So this thing, it's all postcards. There are 400 of them. It's 8 feet tall, 11 feet wide, so it's rather large. And when I say postcards, I mean actual postcards. These are from like the 19-teens through the 1940s, before full-color photography was printing was available. So they read a little bit more like Norman Rockwell prints, and then I'm painting on them, like adding billboards, commentary, terrible things happening, all that kind of stuff. I get these postcards on eBay. It's an interesting, weird recycling type of economy that goes on there. Ideally, I get a huge stack of them, and I have no idea what's going to be in the box. And ideally, they're super cheap, because then that means I have thousands of them to play with. So this is a shot in my studio as I was sort of trying to figure this whole thing out. The whole process, I have to say, is almost entirely improvisational. So I'm literally sifting through these thousands of postcards, trying to find visual connections, horizon lines that line up, colors of backgrounds, colors of the water, land masses that feel like they're sort of belong together, and give just enough of an illusion of unity and continuity to make the whole thing sort of gel. Because after all, I'm presenting 400 individual pictures of separate places from separate times for separate purposes, and I'm asking you to believe that they belong together. Okay, so once the grid, so to speak, is sort of together and it makes sense as a whole, I start planning my interventions. Usually I'm cutting pieces of paper, making sketches. I've got a whole library of them at this time that I sort of like save. And I'm typically sort of tacking these things up on the wall, and then sitting down, looking at them for a while, and then I take them down and paint the stuff in when it seems like it's ready to go. Here I am in my studio, busy at another piece, which is very much like this one. Okay, so back to the thing itself. I'm going to just bring you through a little bit of a tour, because I'm showing you like the overall thing of this. But what happens is when you're interacting with it in person is you take a look from a distance, you walk in, get a little closer, start to wonder what's happening. You start seeing that I've painted a lot of very sort of surprising, unusual types of things in it. One of the magical things that happens with these postcards that I can't take credit for, but it just sort of happened, is that their very recognizable identity makes them comfortable. It makes people comfortable approaching and looking. And a lot of times they sort of find a place that they recognize, somewhere they've been. My grandma lives there, all those other kinds of things. There's a nice sort of air of nostalgia to these two, which makes it also very comfortable and approachable. And that helps me because I'm sneaking in some pretty hard-hitting stuff. So it's a way that sort of like nice backdoor entry into these sort of crisis issues that I'm trying to sort of smuggle in. So there's fires. I don't know if you can see. I'll zoom in on some stuff later, don't worry. There's fires, there's floods, gigantic mutant butterflies, people trying to figure out where to go next as they wander around. Climate refugees everywhere. Tent cities. More mutant butterflies, floods, and graffiti, banners, commentary, billboards, all in this chaotic sort of argument, conversation that's happening in this whole thing. That's sort of a general tour. So one of the things that happened on the previous work that's very similar to this, a good friend of mine said, wow, this thing is like a hyperobject. And I had no idea what he was talking about, but he recommended this book to me. And I read the book, and it is actually super on point. So what's a hyperobject? It's an object massively extended in space and time so that humans can't get a grip on it. What's an example? Styrofoam. Think about a block of pink styrofoam. Maybe it's, you went to Home Depot and you need it to insulate your house. That's styrofoam, but there's also all the styrofoam that's ever been made. Just try and picture that, right? It's still here. 99.99% of it. It's in little crumbles floating in rivers. It's in walls. It's protecting the thing you ordered from Amazon. So just think about all of that. That's a hyperobject. Global warming is also a hyperobject in this way of thinking about things. It's a massive cloud of data, events, circumstances. It's spread across time. It's massively spread across space. We experience it in sort of interruptions and unexpected things like, wow, that was a crazy rainstorm. I've never seen that much rain, especially here at this time of year. Or I can't grow any crops anymore. There's no rain, or there's too much snow. But we can't point at any of that stuff and say that's global warming. So that's one of the problems that people have in terms of grappling with this whole crisis, is we feel like we know it's there, and we feel like there's information that proves it, but it doesn't feel particularly real. So that's one of the things that happens with a hyperobject, and I feel like I've stumbled into sort of some of those aspects of it with my own work. So how do I, sorry, my notes are gonna be super helpful for this one. Well, maybe not, I can't get this. So this thing's 8 feet tall, it's 11 feet wide. It's a rather overwhelming visual experience. And in that regard, it kind of like fits into that whole idea of the global warming hyperobject that you can't get your head around. It's kind of too big to comprehend. There are too many parts. So, and also this whole thing, as you can see, is fragmented, and it's sort of splitting it apart, and it just sort of keys into the whole idea also, right? But also, when you drill down and you look at all the individual cards, you're seeing all the individual stories, all the sort of local manifestations of the thing that you're sort of concerned about, and you can find identifiable, recognizable events and see how they have neighbors and they have other things that they tie into, and then those individual events and localities and small scale narratives add up to the total thing. So it's a way of sort of ideally helping the viewer and people in general sort of grapple with the overwhelmingness of it by letting them come in through the small scale locality of it first. At least I hope that's what's working. Okay, so just about the structure of this thing overall, the way it's visually organized and what that sort of coincidentally ends up helping out with the meaning of the entire thing. So there are two land masses, one at the bottom, one at the top, a large ocean scape. The top of it, all the postcards are upside down. That was something I did purely as a visual exercise to get the thing to work. Just one of those sort of improvisational decisions. I can't quite explain it. That's the way this whole thing works. But it also tied into something that is part of the narrative about why we can't get things done, is that we feel like there are two sides to an issue and they can't understand each other. They're yelling at each other across a giant gulf. They don't see things from the same point of view. We disagree on our facts. So at first I was wondering if I was going to do like a blue zone and a red zone and have them sort of arguing about things, but that seemed completely inappropriate, counterproductive. So what I've done instead is each side, even though they might appear to be oppositional, they're dealing with exactly the same problems, they're making the same mistakes, and they're having exactly the same experience. So there's also, sort of along with the fragmentation of this grid thing, there are all these lines that, this is just sort of an accentuation of them, that I felt I needed to add in there to sort of visually tie the thing together, but they also ended up serving a narrative function because I turned them into bungee cords, and I actually hooked them into pieces of infrastructure, tied them around mountains, locked them into hills and valleys and rivers, and there are places where they're snapping apart. So it's the idea of like a large-scale intervention to try and hold the whole thing together, which is a valiant effort, and it's working in places and not working in other places. It also adds a certain level of comic absurdity, just like the scale of these things and how silly it is to imagine doing that. It also ties into the fact that we have a tendency to duct tape things together just to try and keep rolling. Okay, so now I'm going to roll you through a couple sort of, oh, I'm going a little bit faster than I should. I apologize. Roll you through some close-ups, because so far we've just dealt with the total thing and a little bit of meandering. So the things that happen when we think about the climate crisis and global warming, first we think about the natural disaster. There's the fires, there's the droughts, there's the floods, and those are serious, awful events. But it's also extremely relevant what we do and how people respond and how we talk about them. So in this case, I've got a city that's been flooded. There are broken yachts. There's flotsam and jetsam coming into the bays. And there's been a seawall that's been erected. And then there are towers that are, right, so the circumstances are the floods. The responses, in part, are the walls. But the next level is avoiding the problem by acting like we can all go to Mars, building an ark to sort of sail away and escape the problem in a different way. There's also advertising the condos as a safe, dry place to live. And there's all this graffiti, which is sort of bubbling up from the poor people who are stuck on the wrong side of the tracks. So I wanted to make sure that I sort of included as many of these different kinds of conflicting, arguing voices, because I certainly don't have the answer to any of this kind of stuff, and there are many, many different ways of looking at this stuff, feeling about it. I just wanted to make sure there was enough sort of invitation for viewers to feel like they could see something recognizable and that they could identify with, instead of preaching to people and telling them what to think. So just some more close-ups, some more of this sort of a disaster with the water, and some responses. There's an advertisement for Mars, some exhortations to take care of the climate and take care of the ocean. There's an evacuation point. It's an effort to sort of like help people who are having trouble. So there's cynical responses, there's sort of heartfelt responses, there's government help responses to all these things that are happening. Another thing that I think we're definitely starting to see, and we're going to see more of, are climate refugees, and not just people that we imagine will have problems, but some of us are going to have to pick up and move and go somewhere else. So given that there's a lot of water in this particular piece, just one of those things that just sort of happened is there are a lot of boats in the postcards, because that's what happens with postcards. They're promoting things. So I decided it'd be very interesting and useful to populate these boats with people who are stuck and really have nowhere to go. And maybe they're individually turning these boats into arks and sort of like treating them as if their future home. There are people like running along the highways and trying to get out of whatever situation they're in. There are real situations that we can imagine in terms of flooding. And I've also introduced some sort of fantastical science fiction type things. And that sort of ties into my desire to sort of make the thing more open-ended, introduce some humor, and not have it all be just gloom and doom and heavy hitting in that regard. Just some more of that same kind of thing, tent cities, people getting away. And maybe there's another arc that's being made. Maybe there are 4 of them by now, and they're being promoted as a cynical sort of profit-making enterprise, or maybe it's a legit sort of like effort to actually help people. There's a lot of ambiguity in the way I'm presenting this kind of stuff. Circumstances have changed, that's for sure. Oh, and also, of course, as soon as there are refugees trying to find a better place to live, there are people who don't want them there. A lot of denial. The world is not breaking apart. Escape on the ark. Earth sucks. Private dock, no refugees. Refugees go home. So, I'm just sort of populating this whole thing with as many different points of view and just kind of orchestrating the cacophonous nature of like the public discourse and the way people feel about this kind of stuff. So here's a sea monster. And as I said, I was trying to add a little bit of humor in things. And it's an extremely important thing for me because I'm dealing with some very weighty, heavy kinds of difficult things to think about. And no one likes to be lectured to. And I don't like yelling at people. So if you put those two together, humor is a really great way for me to sort of, again, have sort of a side entrance into the issues and ideally invite people in without them feeling intimidated or like they're being lectured to again. Also, I have to keep myself entertained in the studio. I was at this for almost 10 months. So if I can do something that makes me sort of chuckle, and even if no one else ever sees it, it keeps me rolling because I have to keep myself from like despair, I suppose. So here we are with the sort of the natural disaster part of the fires. You got some like human response. There's some tanks coming into the city, and in the corner down there, there are the billboards protesting and telling people what to do. There's the giant bungee cords, which are an effort to hold it all together. And in the middle of it, these giant caterpillars that are coming and like munching on the towers and drilling holes into the buildings. Just again, a little bit of a slightly absurdist, but equally frightening kind of science fiction version of what we're facing. And maybe it's a revenge of the natural world. You can read it in lots of different kinds of ways. So then here's another version of the escapism. You can see the trails of all the rockets. There's some advertising in some of the islands nearby talking about the Mars launch. In my mind, these people are trying to escape and save themselves using their well-earned capital to sort of leave us all behind. And then sort of like the crowning absurdity and the most ridiculous part of this whole thing is one of those glowing butterflies hatched from the caterpillars taking out one of the rockets and sort of bringing it back down to Earth. Oops. Okay, so I said earlier that this work is in an unusual context, and it's a pop-up. That's temporary sort of takeover of a retail space in Soho, 120 Worcester Street. It's open until like December 22nd. A lot of great programming, talks. I'm going to be doing one there tomorrow night. I think they're going to have a live feed to a climate scientist who's going to be in the Antarctic Ocean, pulling core samples from the seabed and talking about that kind of stuff, live stream. So a lot of really interesting stuff. The point being is that I am putting my artwork, which typically is understood as an aesthetic exercise to be appreciated and maybe purchased, and I'm instrumentalizing it. I'm allowing it to be used as bait and used as a tool to foster conversation, activism, future actions. It's not a typical thing that an artist allows to happen. We're typically very protective of the identity and the sort of like the sanctity of the artwork itself, but at this point, I've just decided to go all in on sort of not worrying about that. I think that kind of started, I've been doing climate work for a while, but in a slightly arch kind of evocative kind of way. And then there was Hurricane Sandy, and it really sort of started to really make a lot more sense for me to just put my chips on the table, so to speak. Right, so the pop-up has my work at the front. People come in. Ideally, the work is accessible enough. It's inviting enough to people get in there, start to think about things a little bit differently. Maybe their fears are accentuated, maybe their hopes are accentuated, and then they're delivered into the back of the space where they're sort of given the tools to sort of write to their congressman, think about things in different ways. And then there's an entire wall of graphics and data. This is just a very small portion of it that I've sort of extracted. And one of the main things that the Climate Museum is trying to get across is that there is a climate supermajority. People tend to believe that if they want to talk about climate change, that they're going to be the lone crazy person in the room, and that other people are going to just sort of not believe them, and they're going to get shut down, and that keeps them from saying anything in the first place. In fact, for example, okay, here we go. Americans supporting major climate policy, meaning funding, regulation, all kinds of actual government action and money and taxes. They support major climate policy by a 2-to-1 margin, but we tend to perceive it as actually the opposite. We think we're in a major, like a super minority. So one of the things the Climate Museum is trying to do, and I'm trying to help them with, is to convince the people that they are in the majority and they can speak out and they can do things and they can feel comfortable talking about this kind of stuff, because the shift in perception allows people to feel like they can take collective action and they can help steer the narrative in a general sense and also influence regulation, influence subsidies, influence the business environment in a way that will be better for everyone else. All right, sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I think I'm wrapping up. Yeah, so the title of this work, Someday All This, brings to mind a couple of possibilities. Someday, my son, all this will be yours. Or someday all this will be gone. Or someday we're going to have to deal with all this. Any of those interpretations are fine by me. And this is just one of those things that just sort of happened as I was working on this piece. This kid kind of like the witness to the whole thing, maybe a stand-in for all of us, is kind of the person that the title's addressed to. And yeah, that's that. Sorry.
I'll need this a little lower. Okay. Thank you, David, for sharing your process and your art with us. I hope many of us are able to go see his piece in person. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Hitul Momaya, and I lead BSR's events strategy. And I have been organizing our events for over 8 years now, and I have to say it's great to be back in person with all of you here today. From my experience, it really is our members and our community that make our events so special, so thank you. I'd like to thank our speakers for a really open and candid conversation. I think we can all vouch for the fact that that's not necessarily the case everywhere you go, so that's greatly appreciated. And I'd like to thank our over 300 participants joining us from around the world virtually. And of course, a special thank you to all of you in the room. I won't take up too much time, but I just wanted to let you know that lunch is ready, so please do join us and continue the conversation. Thank you.